Okay.
Somewhere else.
So now I want to move on to our presentation today, which I'm really excited to hear about. So we have Chuck Smith here, and he's the son of Charles KINGSFORD-SMITH, who's a pioneering aviator. Sir, I'm sorry, my apologies. Sir Charles KINGSFORD-SMITH. I do have a video set up, but I'm going to let Chuck talk first of all. He's going to talk about his dad's exploits. And so, can I, Chuck, do you want to come up and
Sure.
do your bit? And
Okay.
then, we can watch this video afterwards.
Well, I've had a pretty heavy and delicious breakfast. I hope I don't fall asleep or anything, but I doubt that. Excuse me. So I just come up here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I suppose you want me to stand?
Do you want to sit or stand?
I'll stand until I get tired.
Yeah, then we've got a chair for you.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to be here. Excuse me. And in particular because I'm with people who share a common interest in flying. And I myself have been a private pilot. I haven't flown for about 10 years. But before that, I put in almost 50 years as a private pilot, and almost 2,000 hours, and about 400 or 500 of those were IFR, and half of those were, what do you call it, IMC, instrument meteorological conditions or something, flying in the soup. Yeah. So I really have enjoyed flying, and there's something about flying that binds us together, which is obviously why you all are here. But I'm not primarily here on behalf of myself. I'm here on behalf of another pilot who would be just as interested in being here and would love to talk with fellow pilots and to discuss all kinds of things about aviation. But it would be difficult. For one thing, he was born 127 years ago. And I'm 91, so I was born when he was just I was 3 years old when my dad was lost and died. But before then, he had a interesting career. He like you all and me loved flying, and I'm not going to tell you about all of his exploits because if you're interested after this, when you go home, you can find a fairly good write-up on him, what do they call it when they write about somebody's
obituary? Biography,
that's it, thank you. on Wikipedia, which you can get online. And it's fairly detailed and got a lot of interesting stuff in it. And then also, I recommend that you look on YouTube, because there are a number of movie-tone news type things and film clips and old films about his airplane taking off and landing and all kinds of things. But he, as I said, his whole life was consumed with flying once he learned how to do it. And what I am going to tell you is how he learned how to fly. Because he learned how to fly before any of us were born or even thought of. But it has a lot of things in common with what it is today for all of us as we learned how to fly. He became fairly well known for his first major trip. Was the first flight across the Pacific Ocean. And this was in 1928, and the Pacific had been flown from the mainland, California, to Hawaii 2 years before in 26. There were two Army pilots that flew a Fokker trimotor, just like my dad had. And they made that trip, and then there was maybe the infamous Dole race, as they called it, in 1927, where a lot of people were lost, and people looking for the ones that were lost were also lost. So it put flying in a bad taste. But in 1928, he, flying this Fokker high-wing plane with 3 motors, flew with his Australian friend, both of them were Australians, and there were 2 Americans on board, one radio operator and one navigator, and they flew from Oakland to Oahu, to an airstrip that's still there. It's called a Wheeler Field in the middle of Oahu. And then they took the plane over to Kauai, and because there's a very long beach over there that they needed, the plane was heavily loaded with, overloaded with gas. But they needed almost 2 miles to get it off the ground, and they did that, and it was a couple of hours before they could get out of the ground effect. But they finally burned up enough gas, but they flew to the Fijian Islands, which is 3,100 nautical miles, and it took them 33 hours. I think they averaged about 85 to 90 miles an hour. And then from there, they went to Australia through some bad storms. But Australia, after all, is a pretty big target. They didn't have to worry much about the navigation. But Hawaii from the mainland is not a very big target, and neither is Fiji. So they needed this navigator. And one of the things he wanted to do was to show that with proper airplanes, ones with multiple engines, and with good instrumentation, as good as it was in the 20s anyway, that it was feasible. And so when they got to Australia, they were very enthusiastically received. There was probably 10 or 20,000 people in Brisbane to meet the plane, and then the next day they flew to Sydney, and practically the whole town, 50,000 or so people, came out to the little airstrip to meet them and to see this airplane come in, because airplanes were very novel back then. So he went on to do many other things. That was the first crossing of the Pacific, because remember that airplanes had flown the previous couple of years between California and Hawaii, but beyond that, the ocean was a virgin. It had never seen an airplane. So they were the first plane to actually make it from Hawaii on to Australia, across the Pacific. So that got him a fair amount of attention. And the same year, he he crossed the Tasman Sea, which is the name of the ocean between Australia and New Zealand. That was the first crossing of that by an airplane. And then later on did many other things. I think eventually they made the first the first successful east to west crossing of the Atlantic in 1930. There'd been one plane to try that, but they'd crashed. I don't remember if pilots were lost or not on that, but at least my dad's plane made it to Nova Scotia and then down to New York, and then finally they flew all the way back to California to complete a round the world flight. So I'm not going to talk about the details of those flights, because I do encourage you to look up the Wikipedia and YouTube areas, and you'll find a lot of good stuff there that will tell you details I can't get into in a short talk. Plus, which it'll be more interesting than just listening to me drone on about these flights. But he was a very, very popular flyer just because of his characteristics. And I thought I'd tell you about how he learned how to fly, since it has a lot to do with our experience. I mean, things haven't changed a lot in learning how to fly. He was Australian, as I was too, as I was born there. And in 1915, which was the first full year of World War I, World War I started, remember, in August of 1914. And so 1915 was the first full year. He was 18 years old. And he and many of his cobbers, that's the Australian word for buddy, many of the young men that he went around with, wanted to do something for the home country, for England. They wanted to join up and fight the Germans. So because of his age, he no longer had to get his parents okay, and they probably would not have gotten anyway, to sign up. And he and the other young men signed up in ANZAC. You've heard that term. It stands for Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. And they all got on to troop ships and headed for Europe in mid or late 1915. They didn't go all the way to Europe because they stopped in Egypt, which was also a British colony. That's right. So that's the term. And that's where they did a lot of basic training and got ready to fight. And so there he, took basic training and various other things for a few months in Egypt. They also had fun going to Cairo and seeing the pyramids and finding girls and the kind of things that young men do, especially if they're in the army away from home. And so when they shipped out, which was toward the end of that year, they were sent to the Dardanelles, and the Brits wanted to sail their navy through there into the Black Sea. We hear a lot about that these days too, of course. But the Turks were the Ottoman Empire, they called it then, didn't want to do that. So in the Gallipoli, things were bogged down, and this bunch of 10,000 or more young men from Australia and New Zealand and everything mixed with the British soldiers, which were already there, and it was bad. My dad spent about a month with his rifle and in trenches and foxholes. The Turks were on top of the bluff with machine guns, and they made attempts to capture them, but a lot of people were killed, and the casualty rate was really bad. Fortunately for my dad, unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, his commanding officer found out that he knew how to ride a motorcycle, because he'd had one as a young man, and the commanding officer said, "Great, I want you to be a dispatch rider." We had trouble with the telephone system. You remember these old phones that they had in those days? They had the string wires and everything. They didn't always work. So they depended a lot on carrying orders and information, everything back and forth from headquarters to the troops and to the commanding officers in various places. And so my dad became a motorcycle dispatch rider, and he spent several months doing that, and didn't get involved in trying to go over the hump and attack the Turks, which was many times was a sure death. But anyway, the whole effort of Gallipoli was abandoned in early 1916, and it almost caused the collapse of Winston Churchill's military and civilian career, because he was the one who had pushed it, and they had to withdraw. As a consequence, my dad and his cobbers were shipped to Marseille, France, and from there they went up to where the trenches were. You remember how warfare was in those days. There were lines of trenches, and it was fairly stagnant. There wasn't much movement, but there was a lot of casualties that people were firing at each other, and he got into the trenches for a month or two, and then his commanding officer there also discovered that he was a motorcycle rider, and they needed the same thing. So he got in his motorcycle and carried dispatches back and forth. The problem was they were close to the Germans, and he got shot at several times, but they missed. Well, I wouldn't be here. And then in late 1916 or early 1917, I don't remember which, there was I should add this. But as the trench warfare was going on, so was the air warfare, and we've all seen innumerable movies and shorts and everything else about what air warfare was in the first war that aviation played a significant part, of course. I mean, aviation, the Wright brothers had only done their thing about 15 years ago, so aviation was very new, and so aerial warfare, which, as I said, we've all seen so much of, portrayed, was going on, but the big problem was that the attrition rate of pilots was very high, and they estimated that a young man going there into France and flying his single-engine plane, his estimated lifetime was probably 2 or 3 months. I mean, and so the ranks of pilots, both on the German side and on the Allied side, was going down. And so the British Army put out an invitation, I guess you'd call it, to any infantry folks who would like to apply to learn how to fly and become pilots and join the Army Air Corps. I think that's what they called it in Britain. But was that it? Yeah, okay. And so my dad, being sort of mechanically inclined because of his motorcycle experience and just his general nature and everything, thought that was a good idea. So he applied, and so he, and along with a bunch of other young men, were sent across the channel again back to Britain to be interviewed to see if they were appropriate to join the flying corps, see if they had the right characteristics. And he passed pretty well. I think the folks who interviewed him could see that he was fairly bright, and that he seemed to have the kind of characteristics. He was fairly observant, and he just had things that appealed to the people who were interviewing these soldiers to see if they would do it. So he got into the flying school, which was not too far away from where he had been interviewed, in the middle of England somewhere. I wish I knew where, but I don't. And but it's in the farmland and everything. They'd made an airport there, and they had flying school. So he went to the barracks, and his first 2 months in the flying school, he hardly saw an airplane, thanks to the procedures of the British Army, which were well entrenched by that point. He had to take courses and go to lectures and maybe go to the firing range, even, whatever that had to do with flying. He wasn't sure. But he went on for 2 months before he even got close to an airplane. But finally, after that time, and this was late 1916, I guess, by this point, he went out with an instructor, and they got into this plane. Wish I had looked up the name of the plane. But you remember those single-engine planes with front to back seating, and they were biplanes, most of them. And so he got in, and the instructor told him to put his hand on the stick and then move it a little bit this way and a little bit that way and push the pedals a little bit. And he said, "Now I'm going to take off, and I want you just to touch the stick and see what I do. But when we get up to a certain altitude, 1,000 or 2,000 feet, I'm going to let you work with the controls, and you can get some idea of what it does." So my dad, was watching, of course, this whole thing, and they went through the same procedure they still did when I was learning how to fly. Did I tell you, by the way, that I put in 50 years of flying? I think I did. Yeah. And I learned in an Ironka Champ, which is very much like the kind of planes that these guys were flying back then. It was a tail dragger and front to back, and I don't know if ours had a starter or not, but these did not have starters. And so what the pilot did was say, switch off. I mean, the mechanic would say, switch off, and the pilot would echo, switch off. Make sure it was off. And then the mechanic would pull through the propeller a couple of turns just to pump a little bit of gas. And then the mechanic would say, switch on. Yes, sir, switch on. And then the mechanic would pull down, and if he's successful, and then bang, and then finally the thing would rotate, and the mechanic, of course, would have jumped out of the way by then. And the pilot would say, chocks off. And the guy on the ground would pull the chocks away from the wheels because there were no brakes on these planes. And so the pilot would then, put in a little bit more gas, and the plane would start to move over the grass. And my dad was looking down. He was I guess he was in the front seat, come to think of it. Yeah. And you look down, and you could see the grass moving along and the wheels running on the grass, and they got faster and faster. And pretty soon, the noise of the wheels running on the grass stopped. And my dad looked down, and the ground was going away. Now, this experience you probably have all had. We have all been on our first flight when we were taken by an instructor. It was just the same in World War I. And And then, of course, they went up to altitude, and he did what he was told. He moved the stick and noticed what the wings did, and this way, and then pushed the pedals a little bit. Not too much movement, just enough to get a feel for it. And my dad at that point thought, this is the most interesting thing I've ever done in my life. You know, I think we can understand that, perhaps. I do anyway. And so they came on back, and the instructor landed the plane. And then for the next, almost every day after that, for almost 2 weeks, he put in at least an hour of instruction. He learned how to take off and land, and he learned how to maneuver in the air. And then he learned, like I had to learn, how to make a wheel landing. Remember that? Any of you have flown a tail dragger? You have to come in fairly fast at flying speed and get the wheels on the ground, and then gradually pull the stick back as the airspeed tends to decrease, and then the tail hits the ground and so on. Anyway, he went through all this, and after 12 or 13 hours of instruction, he was cleared for solo. And the solo back then was no different than it is these days. I mean, he talked afterwards about getting it off the ground and realizing, I'm the only one here. I can't ask anybody what to do if I feel I'm in trouble. You know? Well, we've all been through that experience, but you have to do it. And he did it. And to his credit, I must say that he was regarded as an intuitively good pilot. We've all known people who have worked really hard, but they aren't natural somehow. They do a good job. But then you'll meet these guys who just look like they were born in an airplane. You know, they just have a feeling for the dynamics of it all and how to control the plane to meet all the conditions that you encounter. And he was known to be one of these, and as his instructors said so, they would write commendations for him and say that KINGSFORD-SMITH is a natural pilot. And he was. His whole life he was considered just an expert pilot. That's one of the best in the world. And when he had some more training there in England, and they practiced dogfighting and all, and by late 1917, early 1918, he was, and the other guys were all sent to an airstrip in northern France. It was about 15 miles from the trench lines, and near Ypres, on the Belgian border of France, and that's where they were headquartered. And so they ate there and slept there when they went flying. But every day they would get up, and because at that point they had to practice flying in the formation following the leader of a squadron of maybe 6 airplanes or something. And they started to fight the Germans, and my dad, they'd had some practice doing this in England, but they got into it pretty fast, and my dad, I guess, during several months of this, did shoot down several planes. I don't have the number, but I think it's like 5 or 4 maybe, and he was shot at several times himself, and but came back to base. But then there was one day in very early 1918, last year of the war, there was one day, January, I think, of that year. Maybe it was late 1917. I don't know the dates, but my father was by himself this time for some reason, and flying at about 1,000 feet, and he saw two German planes fairly close to the ground, a couple of hundred feet high, flying along one after the other. Maybe they were scouting. It was near the trench lines, and he thought, I'm going to hover over them and behind them. They won't see me, and I'm going to dive down on them and shoot them down. There was one problem. There was another guy above him that he hadn't seen. A single German who could see what was happening. He was there's a British plane, and the two Germans much lower, and he could tell what he was doing. So the guy above him came on down and began to fire. And before my dad knew it, the bullets were hitting his plane. Didn't hit him until toward the end. So he tried the maneuvers he knew to get out of the way of this guy flying. I mean, of this guy coming after him from up above. But one bullet went through his left foot, and he could feel that his boot was filling with the blood, and it was painful, of course. And so he did manage to evade the plane that was coming after him. And one of the things that helped was, by that point, they were well on the Allied side of the lines, and so the German decided to go back. All the Germans decided to go back home. It was too much in enemy territory, and so they left. And my dad was able to go back to the field and land, but he was, by that point, he was too weak to get out of the plane. So they had to kind of lift him out and take him to the hospital, and where they had to amputate his two smaller toes and a piece of his foot over there. But they said, you'll still be able to walk and fly. But when mechanics came to look at the plane that he'd been flying, there were over 100 holes from bullets, 2 or 3 of which were right through the area where his head was. And if he hadn't been leaning forward to look at his boot, and maybe because he was feeling faint a little bit, he would have been killed. But he, the worst thing that happened, which is bad enough, was losing those toes and part of his foot. So he recuperated for several weeks in the hospital while they were getting him to walk on crutches and for his foot to heal. And one interesting story, I'll have to tell you this one, is that he and a number of the other guys were going to be awarded the Military Cross. Does that sound right? Have you heard that term?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a British thing for gallantry, essentially. Not exceptional service, but he'd shown himself to be a good pilot, and he'd had shot down several Germans and so on. And so they were going to Buckingham Palace to receive this award. There's about a dozen of them, I think. And they showed up in their uniforms and everything, because my dad had to be there on crutches. And they went to Buckingham Palace, and King George V, the guy with the goatee, was there to give them the cross. And King George came along and pinned the flying cross on each one of these men and said we're happy for the good job you did, and we appreciate it, and so on, all the things he should say. And then the king was getting ready to go, and the protocol in Britain was and is that you don't turn your back on the king and turn around and go home. You back away, or you stand at attention until the king goes. Well, my father had practiced on his crutches, walking forward, but he hadn't practiced walking backward. As a consequence, he went back and fell back over on his back. Who was the first one to come and help him off the ground? The king! And 2 of his officers, and they got him to his feet, and the king, according to what my dad told me, the king put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Son, you can leave here any way that you want to." I think that speaks well for the King of England. And he did not. He wanted to go back and fly. By this point it was the middle of 1918. And remember that the armistice was in November of that year, so there were a few months to go before the war stopped. And he wanted to go fly some more and get into combat, but they decided that he was a better than average pilot by a good shot, and so they kept him in England as an instructor for the rest of the war. And then after the war was over, of course, he was demobbed. And the rest of his life happened. And I'm not going to tell you those details about his flying life, because I really invite you to look at those, to look at Wikipedia and so on. But I do want to pose a question to you before I leave this podium here. And that is, my dad, to an extreme degree, he loved flying more than anything in life, I think. I don't know if he loved it more than his family, but he said he loved it at least as much as his family. And he's, as I said, he was acknowledged to be very good as a pilot. But here's my question. What is it about flying? Tell me your opinion now. What is it about flying that grabs people? And there are several human occupations that have the same kind of a force. One would be sailing. The people who sail sailboats, some of them love it and would rather do that than almost anything else in life. Some people, it may be they love music, let's say, and so playing some instrument might be their sole goal in life. There are several human occupations. Yes.
Well, you asked me that question before the meeting.
I did.
And
you've been thinking about it?
I said at the time that it was the sense of freedom, but I'm going to change that.
Okay.
I think what got me into flying more than anything else, and I was this way from a little kid, not when I discovered flying, but it was the sense of adventure, wanting to find something new all the time. I've never been satisfied. People have asked me, I'm 87 years old, people ask me what I've done in my life. And I've done a little bit of everything because I've always wanted to do something new and different. And as I mentioned, my first exposure to airplanes was when I was about, probably 12, 13 years old, when my older cousin took me out to the airport and introduced me to that kids program that are young. It's like a Boy Scout thing, what do they call it? It's locally here too.
CAP?
What?
CAP?
I guess that's...
Similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
CAP.
You know, and they have an airplane there. So, you know, I've always either wanted to climb a mountain and my first experience with airplanes, of course, was when I was 10 years in naval aviation. So, you know,
Does that for you though? Does that explain the magnetic attraction that piloting and being around airplanes has? Flying them, being there, looking at them, driving to the end of the airport and watching planes take off and land like people do sometimes.
You put me on an excavator. I like, you know,
yeah.
enjoy doing it.
Okay.
I don't, driving a fast car or climbing a mountain.
But does anybody else have some insight as to what it is about flying itself, which has this appeal? Yes, sir.
Well, the definitive answer is that flying, particularly helicopter flying, is the most fun you can have with your clothes on.
Okay. And there are other kinds of fun that use what you're saying? Does anybody else have another view on that, sir?
Camaraderie with like-kind people. I've been flying for 47 years,
mm-hmm.
and I've never been involved in anything other than aviation or outside of aviation related that I've met and had camaraderie with so many neat, great people, all with the same thing in mind.
But if you had the camaraderie in another activity, you'd still feel the same way. But I'm looking for what it is about flying itself which pulls you in. Sir?
I think for me it was a self-confidence in your ability to master a task and demonstrate it publicly by not killing yourself along the way.
That's the way to demonstrate it, all right.
Well, this gentleman mentioned two of them, but Lindbergh said science, beauty, freedom, and adventure. So
okay.
All four put together.
But is there something about the experience of flying itself, ma'am?
Well, I'm a woman.
Yes, we can tell.
Because of that, I feel one step higher than a man when I'm in my airplane.
But what if the men come along and they fly on top of you? What are you going to do? No, but what I'm saying is, I sense from reading about my dad, because I was only 2 3/4 years old when he died, on his last flight, and so I never really had a chance to discuss this with him, which I would love to have done as I got older. But there's something about the substance of flying itself, now, as distinct from sailboating or many other things you can do, that pulls people into it. It isn't just there's the camaraderie, there's the sense of adventure, there's lots of those things which are also part of other activities, but the being in an airplane and controlling an airplane and being up in the sky and doing all this, somehow that particular activity just seems to pull people in. Many of you, it's clear. Anybody want to comment further on that?
Well, the many challenges it presents in different forms, whether you mentioned IFC, whether you're going into rough terrain or short strip, or a challenging airplane or a high performance airplane. It's a mastery of all of that. It's the places where an airplane can take you, and I never get tired of the view from above.
Good point. Now, is it you use the word mastery? Is the fact that you can tell when you've gotten on top of something, and then when you can do a good job of navigation or a good job of flying in a difficult situation or something, the sense of mastery is that what the pull is?
You can reach a point where it's either success or failure. And
yeah.
Yes.
Sometimes if you fail, you can't talk about it anymore. So
Yes.
yeah.
So depending on the challenge.
So in that sense, it's similar to mountain climbing, because people who look at mountains realize this is going to be a tough one. And they have to think very carefully what they're going to do, and then when they get there, they have a sense of accomplishment. I think this is definitely true of flying. Well, I just wanted to raise this issue because I think many of us, if not most of us, share this pull. And for my dad, it was his life. There's no question about it. He loved his family, and he had a wife who loved him, and a family who loved him. He was one of 7 kids. He was the youngest one by 10 years. But so he was the baby of the family. But he was much loved in his family. So he had a good upbringing. But flying was his life, and there's just no question about it. Sir?
Well, you've heard the phrase, it's not a hobby, it's a disease.
Well, yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's right. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Sorry, there's one more thing. 5 minutes at the very most.
You got plenty of time.
Okay. 5 minutes. I had one other thing that I recommend for any of us is sometime during our lifetime, everybody should find something very unusual, out of the ordinary to do. Some people want to take a sailboat across to Hawaii or to New Zealand or something like this, or Australia. And or some might want to climb Mount Everest or something. It's something that's really out of the ordinary, that that's apart from your normal life. Well, I got a chance to do that. My father flew the Pacific the first time in 1928. So in 1978, which was the 50th anniversary, with some talking on my part and looking for possibilities, I was able to fly a commemorative flight of that flight across from California to Australia. What happened is I got the Cessna company to lend me an airplane. It was a Cessna 340, which is a twin, which happens to be pressurized, which is very helpful. And so, and I was quite sure I could do this on my own or with a friend. However, the Cessna company said, we're sending our chief pilot along with you, because he's done this quite a few times. And just in case you have any problems, well, that sort of lowered the blood pressure on my wife and my mother. You know, 'cause they were enthusiastic about it, but not that enthusiastic about my doing it on my own. So this other man and I flew from Oakland to Honolulu, and then from we didn't have the range. We'd taken the back seat out of the Cessna and put in 500-gallon tank of gas and things like this. So we had plenty of range. And then when it got to Australia, the seats would be put back in. But we had it in the meantime for us to fly, and so we couldn't make it all the way from Hawaii to Fiji, and so we had to land in the Marshall Islands just for an overnight because we just didn't quite have the full range that my dad's plane had. And then we flew on to Brisbane. I too had a crowd of people come to the airport for this. There's a commemorative flight. They said the son of a Smithy. That was his nickname around the world. Was a Smithy. His last name is Kingsford-SMITH. And so I had to make rounds of about a month of going to banquets and things like that. But interestingly, the most touching aspect of this whole adventure was when I was in Australia in '78. There were quite a few people, old people by that point. Old men would come up to me and say, "Son, I want to shake your hand. You're the son of my boyhood hero." And then they would give me something. It turned out to be a ticket that they had purchased when my dad was trying to feed his family during the Depression by giving a joyrides in his plane. We'd go to an airport in a town in Australia, and they would advertise that for 10 shillings or 2 bob, or for 2 pounds. I've forgotten what it was, but a fair amount of money. He would give a 10 or 15-minute ride. And these guys had saved their ticket, and they gave it to me. And I thought, boy, that really adds to the joy of this adventure trip that I was having. So I recommend, if you haven't done this already, before you get too old, think of something that's way out of the ordinary and do it.
Amen.
And then you can give a talk about it.
Chuck, you say he was lost. He was lost at sea?
He was lost at sea. He was flying
Was there any speculation as to...
well, the plane he was flying, I don't know if I have a picture of it or not. Yeah, here it is. Here's the plane he was flying. It was a Lockheed Altair, and for its time, it was designed in the early 30s, but it was advanced. It was a monoplane, low wing. It had retractable wheels, which was kind of novel, and it had a variable pitch prop, and it had a turbocharger on the engine so it could fly at higher altitudes, and there were a couple other things that were fairly modern. He was flying this plane, and he wanted to break the record from England to Australia, which he had set himself some years before in both in the Southern Cross, which is his trimotor Fokker, or in another plane. He also did some records in another plane. But anyway, he was flying this plane, and they were doing pretty well. The last stop was in the central part of India, in Allahabad. So they gassed up there and headed out, and the next leg was nonstop from there to Singapore, and they never arrived at Singapore. And they speculated that he'd gone down at sea in the Andaman Sea somewhere, which is between India and Burma, essentially now Myanmar, I guess, and Thailand. And so they searched. There was military searches and civilian searches in those days, and they looked for the plane and found no trace, except 2 years later, a airplane wheel showed up with the tire still inflated, which was definitely traced to his plane. So he'd apparently, I won't go into the details again. That'll probably be carried to some degree in the biography. But they're pretty sure that he must have gone down in the ocean, and the plane sunk to the bottom in probably 80 feet of water or something like this. There have been several attempts to find the plane. One guy in particular has made 8 or 10 expeditions on his own to try to find the wreckage of the plane, but and he thinks he has, but his results are being sort of questioned. We're not sure if they. I kind of wish they had discovered the plane, because I would have liked that chapter to have been closed, but it isn't, and so it's still somewhat of a mystery about what happened to him. But you know, he died doing what he loved, and that's kind of the point I'm making about what it is about flying that is so captivating. Sir?
The photograph that you have there, is that, the airplane was made by Lockheed, right?
That's right.
What, is that Santa Barbara by any chance?
Yes, I think so.
Because the Lockheed company started in Santa Barbara, and it was originally Loghead, Loghead.
Yeah.
And that was the name of the brothers that started the company, and
That's right.
they decided that spelling wasn't commercially too.
That's Scots or something, is that?
So they changed it to Lockheed.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it was Lockheed Altair, and they only made about 5 or 6 of them. I don't. And this had belonged to somebody else, somebody famous, I think, and I can't pull out who it was when he bought the plane.
Yeah,
but he liked it.
I spent quite a bit of time flying out of Santa Barbara some years back, and I recognized the.
Yeah, and this was taken in. That's one other thing he did, was he made the first west to east crossing of the Pacific in this plane, with 2 of them aboard. And it's a single engine plane, and they flew from Brisbane to Los Angeles. So that was in 1934. So he made both crossings, both first crossings across the Pacific where he did.
Was the airplane shipped to Australia? Or
yes, it was shipped to England from. Okay, it was shipped to England from the U.S. because when they flew in '34, then my dad flew it to New York or somewhere in the East Coast. I don't remember where, and it was shipped from there to England. And then in '35 was when he made his attempt to fly to Australia, the plane already being in England. So he took a boat to England, and that was it. You know, that was, he and his mechanic were on board this plane. So you probably know some of these older planes you needed to pay a lot of attention to, do some adjustment almost every time you landed. You know. And so he had an ace mechanic along, the guy he really liked, and they were both lost. And my mother was a widow at 25, with a little boy, not quite 3 years old.
That was a difficult one.
Yeah. So, and as I say, one thing, I guess, one of my great regrets in life, I don't have a lot of them, but this is one, is I would have loved to have talked with him and vicariously learned what it was like to do these adventuresome trips, and of course I never did. So So what do you do when you would like to know something historical, but there's nobody around to talk to? Well, you find a good book that portrays the situation and that era very well, and there are several having to do with this. And for instance, we can all get a feeling for what it must have been like for the Wright brothers, because they've been written up really well by David McCullough, for instance, and people like that. And so that's how you learn. But I would, given that I was his only child, actually, my mother was pregnant when he went down, but she miscarried probably because of the shock of it all, of the fact that he was lost. And
so what was your father's name? Again?
Charles, and his last name is KINGSFORD-SMITH, Kingsford-Smith.
Okay, thank you.
Sir Charles.
Well, yeah. Sir?
I failed to mention that one of the appeals, another one of the appeals of aviation is that there's so many variations of it. You mentioned helicopter.
Good point.
There's gliders, there's a
Yeah.
paraglider, there's
Balloons.
aerobatics,
Yeah.
balloons, and then there's floats and there's skis. And so I see that you have engaged, or this airplane has engaged.
That's not me, yeah.
No, it's not. Okay.
Yeah.
What's that?
Betty bought those pictures.
Oh, okay.
But
Oh.
it's appropriate that it's
Okay.
an Aronca.
Yeah.
Yes, I just didn't know if you had done, I was gonna ask about your ski
No.
flying, because not a lot of
I
people.
haven't done any of that. I
Oh, okay.
haven't flown a float plane either. I'd love to have done that sometime.
Right.
That's
I'm a
the
little,
second most fun type of thing.
okay. Sir?
Because the emphasis is always on pilots, but as this conversation has been going on, I relate to the idea of the mechanic flying, and then he becomes the flight control, what do you call it, the flight engineer.
Flight engineer, as we used to have on every plane.
As we've gotten rid of the flight engineer in the military, you still have the plane captain, and they're all in this line of the maintaining people who maintain the airplane. And they are very much part of this, maybe not so much
Well,
our pilots here, but
For many decades, they,
EAA
Yeah.
understand that clearly, how important that, and how
Well,
that brings into so many people in the.
the big airliners had flight engineers until just a couple of decades ago. I mean, that was a major position.
I flew in the military in that era,
Yeah.
too. And I've been in this organization talking to what was fellow that was in the P2Vs who was a flight engineer. I've forgotten who he was. He retired by now.
Joe
And I
here
flew in a
is
crew of-
Susan, he was an engineer on a P2V.
Another question for you.
Sir.
So clearly your avocation was flying. What was your vocation? You
I
didn't
was
follow your father.
I'm an engineer, and I worked on radio and electronics for Hewlett-Packard primarily.
Okay.
And that probably has a stronger hold on me than flying does. But flying has a strong hold. But I learned about radio when I was about 13 years old or 14. Saw some ham radio operators, and then I got to a broadcast station. I saw the needles flicker as people talked, and I mean it got to me, and I spent my career working on electronics, and I love it. I still do, even though I'm retired. I'm 91 now.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just like to mention to the group, a little historical thing on Sir Charles Kingsford-Smith is in Vancouver. There's an elementary school named after him. It was very close to where I grew up. And, he was very, very strongly recognized within the British Empire at that time, now the Commonwealth.
Yes. And the reason that his name was there at all was because when he was a small boy, from about age 3 to 9 or 7 or something like that, they lived in Vancouver. His dad was a bank manager, and didn't have a very good job in Australia, and was looking for new realms to conquer. So he moved his whole family to Vancouver for that. But then they went back to Australia after a while because he had a good offer. So the fact that he had been a resident of Vancouver was, I guess, was the linkage why they have the school named after him.
When was he knighted?
In 1930,
Okay,
before I was born.
okay.
Yeah, and it was knighted just before he was married in December of 1930, and I was born in the end of 1932. So he was married and knighted, I guess, just before then.
Was it King George, was it?
King George V.
Fifth, yeah.
King George V,
So he went in twice, once in the First World War and once when he got knighted.
No, he wasn't knighted in the First World War. He just
No,
he got
they met him at
he got
the
the
DFC.
military cross,
Right.
whatever that is.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, but he was knighted in 1930.
The same king? The same king.
Yeah, but he didn't go to London to do that. It was just, what do they have? They say they have the list that the Queen or the King puts out every year with
Yeah, yeah.
a list of people, and he was on the list. So he was Sir Charles. and I am not Sir Charles, even though my mother thought maybe you should escort something. I said, not in America, I'm not going to do it.
So, since you were obviously raised in Australia, how is it that you end up in the U.S.?
My mother remarried 3 years after my father was lost. And he was a Brit that had been raised and spent most of his life in the U.S. and he was working in Australia for the ethyl corporation. Remember tetraethyl lead they put in gasoline, and in late 1939, Ethel told him to come back to the U.S. because their business was drying up because of all the activity of the Japanese in the Western Pacific. So he and my mother came to the U.S. to live, and I didn't get my visa for another year, so I stayed with my grandparents, which I enjoyed a lot, frankly. And in 1941, I took a boat from a Matson line, some of you may have been on those, from Australia to the U.S., and my mother came across to meet me at San Pedro, and we went to Atlanta, where I spent the war years. And once the war started, there was no chance of going back to Australia. And then then we stayed on. My stepfather kept working for Ethel in the U.S., and I went to high school and finally to college. And when I was about to graduate, I thought, I've lived in this country for longer than I ever lived in Australia. The country has protected me, it's educated me. I owe my loyalty to the U.S., and so I applied for a naturalization and got it. So I became a citizen just about age 21. And I've lived here the rest of my life. But I still love Australia. and I've been back several times, most recently about 5 years ago.
So where now that you're here, how is it? I mean, do you live anywhere nearby?
I live in Bellingham now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I didn't make any real special trip to get here. It was easy. No IFR.
Rush hour, that can be charged.
Oh dear.
You had to brave the guides.
Indeed.
So when was the last time you flew, and what were you flying then?
Well, I flew about 12 years ago, and I hung up my goggles then because I was getting a bit old, and it was a bit expensive, and I had other things I wanted to do, and I took to riding my motorcycle, and so I did that for a number of years, and I gave that up a few years ago. So I like activity also.
Right. And what were you flying? What was the flying?
The last time I flew, the last airplane I was a part owner of was a Cessna 210.
Oh, a 210.
And a non-pressurized plane, but still with retractable wheels and plenty of power. And I took my family, my wife and 2 children, numerous times to Mexico and various other places. I've done lots of private flying, and I enjoyed almost every minute of it. Some minutes I didn't enjoy, but.
And so then, did your wife and or kids learn to fly?
No, they never learned how to fly, but they certainly learned how to be passengers. And after a while, I couldn't believe it, but they would be bored. Although we did have one advantage. You know how many of us have had the problem with, when are we going to get there, Dad? And all this stuff. Well, when we get up to 12,000 feet, they fall asleep. And so for the rest of the time, they're zonked out in the rear seat. They come on down and they wake up. And also, I found out that when you clear customs coming back to the U.S. from Mexico, if the customs start, making a fuss, and I just turned the kids loose and let them run round and round, and they get us out of there pretty quick. It was advantageous. So I've had, it's been a really enjoyable part of my life, just not the main part of my life.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for your opportunity. And I hope you will look up some of those things and find out some of the details for yourself, because flying in the early days is really an exciting thing. I mean, they're just, it was so new to everybody, and it was so appealing. The idea of being able to go through the air from here to there and everything was just something that took people a while to absorb. They really liked it. So I understand that now.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
No.
Okay.
Any idea why your father and Lindbergh were together?
Yes, Lindbergh wanted to meet him.
Oh, okay.
But here's something funny. My father was 5'6" or 7". Lindbergh was 6'2" or something like that. And when this picture came home, his brothers looked at it and said, "Look at there, he's standing on his toes." and they hounded him about it in good fun, of course, But he must have been.
Oh, I know.
Isn't that cool? That was so funny.
Oh, that's who?
I don't know who that guy is, but.
And do you know where this was?
He was in a hotel in New York.
Okay.
But my dad. This was after my dad flew from Ireland to North America, and then they wanted to fly back to California, and so he went to New York. And by the way, we went to Boston. He went to Washington. Was taken for lunch at the White House too. It was kind of neat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And can you read? I can't.
That's his signature. That's his signature. Yeah.
Oh, his signature.
See KINGSFORD-SMITH. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Tremendous. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Sorry. Thanks. Oh yeah, this is this is a replica of his plane.
All right, guys, let's go. That's Australia, of course, that they're flying over.
None of that nasty nose wheel.
So a little bit of information about this flight. As I mentioned, there were two Qantas fellows took the airplane out for this flight. And do you notice the first approach, they didn't land? Yes. Well, they got themselves bent out of shape a little bit. They didn't want to crash it like the other guys did. And they came back, and the second approach, they made a nice successful landing. But they asked him afterwards, they said, well, how did the airplane fly? He said, well, if you looked away, it went somewhere else. So you know that when Sir Charles flew this airplane across the Pacific, you flew it every second.
That's right.
It was, you know, when you think of the 33-hour leg from Hawaii down to Fiji, and it was hands-on watching it every.
The whole time.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
It's a good thing that there were two of them though, so his co-pilot could take the yoke for a few hours at a time. Boy.
Okay, well, thank you guys. It was a great weekend.
How does that differ
Thanks, Chuck. It
from
was
the
amazing
tri-motor?
presentation.
It was pretty similar in appearance.